Okay, so let's continue with chapter 9 then. So last chapter, chapter 8, was a relatively brief chapter, but it was a chapter in which we talked about the era of good feelings, and we kind of already went over what that meant. And again, I would hope that from your notes you'd be able to kind of describe what this era was. But we also talked about some of the divisions that lie underneath the surface of the United States. One being the division between North and South, which we'll talk about a lot more in the upcoming chapters. But another division was the division between what we might call the common and elite classes. And this division between the common and elite classes manifested in the election of Andrew Jackson in 1828. And we talked a little bit about Andrew Jackson, how his political career started. Chapter 9, for the most part, is a chapter that is really all about the presidency of Jackson. And there's going to be three major kind of events that take place during his presidency that you're going to want to know. At the very end of chapter 8, we talked about Jackson's inauguration. That is the speech in which a president gives every time they assume office. That it was a rather somber mood because of the death of his wife, who he believed was killed by his political rivals. But his inauguration was also it was really an event and a sign here. This illustration is supposedly that of Jackson's inauguration, and what the elite classes stated. Remember, Andrew Jackson represented the interests of the common classes. What the elite classes claimed during the inauguration essentially was that the barbarians had taken over Rome, and that's kind of a good way to characterize what the feeling was like. Now, on the other hand, what changed to make Andrew Jackson's election possible? Well, the 1820s to the 1830s is sometimes described as this period of expanding democracy. It's also sometimes referred to as Jacksonian democracy. And what we mean by that are changes into the requirements to the right to vote. Now, recall, when it comes to voting, for the most part this is still even true to a certain degree today, is that the Constitution allows for states to control their own voting laws. So while voting laws may differ slightly in different states, for the most part, we can say that following right after the Constitution, there were pretty much three criteria. For the most part, states limited the right to vote to white persons. The second one is that they limited it to men only, or those who were male. And then there was some sort of financial requirement, right? Some sort of wealth, tax, land. One had to be white, a male, but also own some land maybe in some states, had to pay a tax in some states, had to achieve some sort of certain amount of wealth. And the belief was that, one could only vote in the interests of the nation if they were actually invested in it, if they had something to lose. Because if you didn't have anything to lose, well then, according to, many of the creators of these state constitutions, that, there would be no interest in following the day-to-day politics. You wouldn't be an informed voter. And you could essentially vote to kind of just mess up the system, so to speak. And this is what changed in the period of Jacksonian democracy, is that states, piece by piece, started to remove this land and wealth requirement. And that allowed for an entire group of people, right, to vote for their candidate in which they were previously excluded. And this is what we mean by this democratization of the United States at the time, right? So it's the removal of either wealth or financial requirements. And again, this was done on a state-by-state level. So depending on which state we're talking about, the year in which that voting law changed would differ, right? And one of the reasons why states moved to do this was because a lot of the newer states that were being created out west, in an effort to try and draw more people and more settlers to their regions, they didn't require any sort of wealth or financial requirements, and this created somewhat of a competition between all the other states, so they kind of forced them or forced their hand. This period of democracy in America, as it's called, was, or I should say that we have a very valuable primary source from this period, and it's a book called Democracy in America. So this is the title of the book. Alexis de Tocqueville, he was a French aristocrat, right? This is him right here. And at the time, an important kind of historical context to understand about the 1820s and 1830s is that while the American Revolution succeeded in creating a free and independent nation, there was that time period where it was questionable if the U.S. would continue to survive, moving from the Articles to the Constitution. But for the most part, the principles of liberty and democracy and republicanism survived. In France, that wasn't the case, right? Napoleon, who was essentially the dictator of the French Revolution, was defeated. And in a lot of European countries, a lot of the changes that took place regarding the Enlightenment and politics and everything else, those were reverted. So at the time, the United States was the most democratic place in the world. And Tocqueville arrived in the United States, essentially traveled all over and took account from an outsider's perspective of what exactly democracy in America was all about. So not immediately, but in the future, you'll have the chance to read about what Tocqueville actually wrote in Democracy in America through some of our sources. So more people voting, right? And that's probably the most important kind of political change happening in this particular era. Another important political change taking place is not just people voting for the very first time, but also the emergence of a second party system, right? So recall our first party system was Federalists and Republicans. That was pretty much Hamilton versus Jefferson in a lot of ways. The Federalist Party was blamed as being treasonous. The Republicans ruled for a very long time. Along comes Andrew Jackson. He establishes the Democratic Party, right? This is a new political party. This is the pro-Jackson Party. And it's interesting because the Democratic Party initially doesn't really stand for a lot of issues per se, but it was a party really kind of based off of the personality and the charisma and the story behind Jackson, right? It was Jackson came first and the party came second. And a lot of times Andrew Jackson doesn't operate within what many members of his party believe or the ideology. Jackson's not an ideologue. He's not, he doesn't think about policy in like an academic way or anything like that. It's kind of a guy who goes with his gut in certain senses. And the party that came to oppose him was the Whigs, right? The anti-Jackson party. Oops. And again, anybody who hated Andrew Jackson found themselves in the Whig Party. And pretty soon, even long after Andrew Jackson was president, and long after Andrew Jackson even had any influence in politics, both of these parties continued to exist. So this gives us our second party system. And a party system is any time in the United States when two political parties are the dominant kind of force, right? No matter where one is, there's pretty much two different options. And from about, we'll say the Whigs came a little bit after, but we'll just say 1828. That's when Andrew Jackson first became president. Till about 54 is the exact year. So for, 25 years, 26 years, whatever that is, there were pretty much just two different political parties that one could vote for. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the positions that the Whigs and the Democrats have. Again, in the beginning, they're not a position-based party system. They're a personality-based party system, but eventually they do find their kind of various positions on certain issues in the United States. Also, one thing we have to keep in mind, I think we talked about this already, right? That Jackson represents the interests of the common people. Recall that the election of 1828 and even the election of 1824 was very bitter. Jackson blames his political rivals for the death of his wife. That's kind of the tone, you might say, of politics during Jackson's time in office. And he's running as an anti-elite. So when it comes to staffing people in the government, who's going to work in Jackson's government? Well, it can't be anybody who's there previously, because that kind of goes against everything that Jackson stands for. And so the way in which Jackson staffs positions within the government, the way that he creates essentially the people who work for him or who he relies upon for outside information, is to base that off of trust and loyalty. So the spoil system, this was a strategy by Andrew Jackson, and the spoil system says essentially staff the government with people you can trust / or with people who are loyal. This is in some ways the exact opposite of what someone like George Washington did, where his strategy was to hire the person best for the job. George Washington's cabinet consisted of Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, who absolutely despised one another, but they were the most able for that position. Jackson's system is not about that. Instead, it's more about, can I trust you? Then what can you do? Are you loyal to me? Right? So this meant most of his friends. On the one hand, you could say that this was a strategy which led to ineffective government, right? If you have your Secretary of Treasury, like, your uncle or something like that, who knows nothing about the Treasury. But at the same time, we have to recall that this is still pretty early in, American history. And if you look at revolutionary movements throughout Latin America, for example, there have been many military coups and attempted overthrows of the government. I mean, we talked about one in this class where Aaron Burr, had attempted to create his own separatist states. So, staffing people around you with people you can trust and people who won't turn on you and people who won't try to overthrow your regime. Again, this is a new political party with a presidential candidate who doesn't represent, where is he at, right? Common, doesn't represent any of the interests of the powerful. I mean, he's going against businesses, he's going against bankers, he's going against merchants, he's going against politicians, he's going against the Virginia dynasty of Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. Maybe it's a good idea to establish people who are loyal to you and people who you can trust. So there's two different sides to that coin there, but that's certainly what Jackson did. All right, any questions so far? Okay. So for Jackson's presidency, there are kind of three major events to know and understand about Jackson's presidency. The first one is nullification. So I'll write a yellow number 1 right next to that, right? The nullification crisis. In fact, we already went over this term before. This will be kind of like good bonus points to whoever can remember this, but either type it in the chat or say it. Does anybody remember what nullify or what nullification is? Good, exactly, right? States essentially do not or will not follow federal laws. And this idea was put forward by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. It was in response to John Adams and Alexander Hamilton's Alien and Sedition. In other words, Alien and specifically the Sedition Act was a violation of the Constitution, and so a state like Virginia and Kentucky when looking at the two options, do you follow Congress or do you follow the Constitution? Jefferson and Madison said, we're going to follow the Constitution and screw your laws, right? Remember, where do laws come from? Laws come from the Congress, right? Congress is just the representation of the states. Now, it's typically the Supreme Court's job to rule whether or not laws are constitutional, but in this case, that was a power not yet taken by the Supreme Court. In this case, the states are taking that power. And so we talked about it earlier with tariffs, right? A tariff, recall, a tax on imports, right? These are generally good for industry, but for the most part in the United States, the industry is in the North, right? It is bad for everyone else, namely the South. And so when the United States passes tariffs, right, that is a tax on imports, John C. Calhoun, who is vice president and senator from South Carolina, very important politician in this kind of pre-Civil War era, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina says, no, we're not going to follow this tax, right? All this tax does is it makes imports more expensive and forces South Carolina to buy industry created by northern factories. And in invoking this, John C. Calhoun uses the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment is generally considered to be the states' rights amendment. Essentially says any power not any power not in the Constitution is kind of knocked down to the states. So it's like, it's the last amendment when it came to the Bill of Rights. And it was just like, if there's anything that we missed, the states will handle it, right? Essentially. And, this has been often cited as not just states' right, but kind of like the power of states' rights. And that's essentially what John C. Calhoun is invoking here, is that ultimately when push comes to shove via the 10th Amendment, the states have the right to nullify laws. Now, again, this is crucial to how our federal system is set up. Again, you have a federal government on the one hand, and you have the state governments on the other. And the justification for this is, it can go a couple of ways, right? So for example, Calhoun and others who support states' rights would say something like, the United States is a voluntary union, and therefore, if South Carolina could join the United States voluntarily, it has more power in dictating which laws it wants to follow or not. Another way of thinking about it is, well, what came first? Did South Carolina come first or the United States? And the question is, South Carolina did, right? The states created the nation. Therefore, the states should have the final say. This crisis over nullification ultimately created a split between Calhoun, who was the vice president, and Jackson, right? So we might say the rise of Van Buren has to do with the split between Calhoun, who was the vice president, and Andrew Jackson chose Calhoun because he had a prominent political career. Again, he wasn't, Calhoun was maybe one of those outsiders. He was in some ways kind of like an established politician. He was one of those war hawks. He was a new nationalist. So Jackson and Calhoun never really got along to begin with, but definitely when it came to this issue of tariffs, because when it came to tariffs, Jackson was pro-tariff. And again, this just kind of goes to show you the lack of any type of political ideology by Andrew Jackson, because Andrew Jackson's from the South. He's from Tennessee. He should technically be against tariffs. If we were just to go back to our Democrats and our Whigs, Democrats in general would be anti-tariff in some cases, right? The Whigs, generally speaking, would be pro-tariff. But again, it's just, politics when it's convenient for Jackson. And what that allows for is Martin Van Buren, right, to become Jackson's new favorite kind of right-hand man. So we'll say Martin Van Buren becomes Jackson's, I will just say favorite, right? He eventually becomes, later on in Jackson's second term, vice president. So Jackson is president from 1828 to 1832, and then again in 1832. And so his VP for his first term in office was Calhoun. Well, I believe Calhoun I think resigned. I think he's the only he's not the only vice president to do that, but I think he actually resigned, just, kind of to show you the split that occurred between Calhoun and Jackson. And then in 1832, it was Martin Van Buren who became his vice president. Very interesting, Van Buren, like the complete opposite of Andrew Jackson. Jackson's this war hero who was, accused of murdering people and, dueled people, killed someone in a duel, actually, Jackson did. And Martin Van Buren's kind of this like short brainiac who can't ride a horse, so it's kind of like, the odd couple in some ways. And, this created in various political circles, especially with Jackson himself, a division in Jackson's cabinet. Again, recall that a cabinet is the president's closest advisors. It was created by essentially George Washington and, other presidents, kind of kept that trend, you might say. We're talking about Secretary of War, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of State, right? These are the people who the president relies upon and talks to pretty much every single day. Well, John C. Calhoun and his buddies were a big part of the president's official cabinet, right? The vice president is a major part of that cabinet. But since the two split up, Jackson instead, running out of room here, created like an unofficial cabinet, right, which included Martin Van Buren. So Jackson was no longer working with the Calhouns and stuff like that. This was a political administration that was very divided, that wasn't talking to one another. And so again, the kitchen cabinet, it's kind of a play on words, right? Included Martin Van Buren and other unofficial members that, again, were more loyal to what Jackson had to say. Now, this question about tariffs came to a very intense climax. First, in a debate, the Webster-Hayne debate, which is another primary source in which you will have the opportunity to read. The Webster-Hayne debate, as you might imagine, consisted of Robert Hayne from the South, Daniel Webster from the North. I believe both were senators. They were definitely in Congress. And Daniel Webster was a senator. I think Robert Hayne was also a senator, South Carolina. And this was a debate that initially started off, I think, like arguing about Western lands, but pretty soon came back to this issue of tariffs and really encapsulated the intense political division that was going on at the time. Because it was a debate about tariffs, but it was a more fundamental debate. It was a debate about the rights that states have and the power that the national government has. And I won't talk too much about the debate in particular. I gave you just kind of a brief snippet in the primary source, so you have a chance to kind of get a feel for what it's about. But you have two distinct positions that are held. And in the aftermath of the debate, there was a dinner in which both Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun attended, right? Where essentially Jackson restated what Daniel Webster had stated, right? And that was the supremacy of the Union meaning the federal, the United States. Webster says something along the lines of, the Union now and forever. And of course, Calhoun's response is, there's only one other thing more precious than the Union, and that is liberty, right? And this gets down to kind of like the fundamental difference in a lot of ways between these two particular positions. And it kind of reveals a lot about American national identity. American national identity is in part defined by revolution, And so for Calhoun, again, and for those like him, they would argue, or they would make the case that the only thing more important than the actual United States itself, because when you think about that, it's like, what could be more important than the United States? Well, Calhoun and his advocates would say, liberty is more important than that. So that was going on like a more intellectual level. But the rubber actually did hit the road, the Nullification Crisis. In the 1830s, Congress passed another tariff, right? The Tariff of Abominations. This was the what Calhoun and other Southerners, I'll just say Calhoun and Company, called the tariff. And this time, rather than just the rhetoric, the state of South Carolina actually voted to nullify the tariff. Officially, the state legislature in South Carolina essentially said, look, we're not going to follow this tax. We will allow in South Carolina imports to come in, right, duty-free, no taxes. That way, we can buy better quality goods for a cheaper price. Congress responded by passing the Force Bill. So this is Congress, the Force Bill, and this allows Jackson, the president, to use armed force to enforce the tariff. All right. So now things are getting a little bit more intense, you might say. Jackson himself, a military guy, even remarked that if any blood was shed in opposition to the tariff, he'll march an army down to South Carolina, hang the first man that he sees from a tree, and if it's John C. Calhoun, all the better. Right. South Carolina responds by nullifying the Force Bill, right? Just to add insult to injury. This is defiance in its most extreme case, right? Not only saying the original nullification of what they objected to was unjust, but we'll even go further and nullify the fact that Jackson has the right or authority to use this. So this crisis, it's I might have to check the specific year, but I think we're 1832, I want to say. I might be wrong on that. I'll have to check the exact year, but certainly in the 1830s. This is about the closest that the United States gets to a civil war before the Civil War actually happened, right? Like if you were to look at the history of the United States and say, was there any point in which the North and South went to war with each other? Well, in this case, it almost happened. Now, luckily, Henry Clay, the great compromiser, as he's known as, came to the rescue and created a tariff which gradually went to zero, right? So Henry Clay comes along. He's able to get politicians to kind of have cooler heads. They prevail. The tariff will begin taxing goods at first, but will eventually go down to zero. And this was good enough for Andrew Jackson to not march an army down to South Carolina. This was good to kind of put an end to this continued opposition, but very intense right here in 1832. Now, of course, in terms of Jackson, it's interesting to note that his position here is actually with national power, right? Jackson, in this case, sides with the federal government. That isn't always the case. I do just want to bring our attention real quick to this. Let's see if I can actually zoom in here. Oops, that's not what I want to do. To this political cartoon, because this is kind of a really good illustration. So you can see, I'm not sure how well you can see actually, but hopefully you can see some of the steps here on it. I think that this is actually supposed to, I think this is Jackson right here. I don't know for sure. But anyways, you can see the very first step, and this is talking about nullification. The first step is nullification. That would be the idea that states have the rights to follow pretty much whatever laws they want to. Well, nullification leads to the South Carolina Ordinance, which of course South Carolina passed. That essentially, once you're going against your own country, that's essentially treason. Treason leads to civil war. Civil war leads to deception. Deception leads to disunion. And ultimately, where we end up is despotism, which is like a form of, to be a despot is like to be like a totalitarian ruler or an authoritarian ruler, like a monarch, a king, right? Signaled by the crown. So the author of this political cartoon is expressing something pretty powerful. Here you see with two dead people. This is the Constitution, right? So you might as well just stab the Constitution and kill it. I think this is the Latin, is this the out of one comes many or out of many comes one? Something along those lines, right? But essentially what the authors of this cartoon are saying is not only is nullification illegal, which it is, not only will nullification lead to a civil war, which it could, but in fact, nullification could lead directly to the end of this great experiment in democracy and liberty. Again, it's easy for us now to look back on history and say, well, obviously democratic governments were going to win out, right? Before the American Revolution, there were 0 democracies. And today, like 98% of all countries are democracies, right? That was just destined or bound to happen. But while this is occurring in the 1830s, and we have to keep in mind that yes, there have been revolutions around the world. The French Revolution happened in Europe, but Napoleon was defeated. In 1830, the King of France still exists, right? There's a King of France. There's a Tsar in Russia. There is, in Latin America, which went through similar revolutions, there are constant military coups where military generals are asserting themselves as authoritarians. So, this democracy thing, this liberty thing, this government based off of by the people, for the people, it's very fragile, especially in this time period. And if South Carolina isn't careful about this, not only will it lead to the ending of the United States, but it'll lead to all democratic government everywhere, forever, right? Pretty dramatic, but that's ultimately the sort of image that the author wants to portray here. So very applicable cartoon, at least to this example. Okay, so that's the nullification crisis. Any questions about that? Okay, so let's draw our big number 2. Second thing that Jackson is responsible for, and that is a change in Native American policy. Now, if we recall, we reviewed a little bit already in regards to how the national government interacted and conducted diplomacy with indigenous tribes in North America. Initially, it was this idea of nations within a nation. And that was essentially to treat tribes like the Cherokee, like the Creek, like the Choctaw, to treat them as foreign and sovereign entities, that the United States would conduct diplomacy in the same way it would the Cherokee as it would with France. And so with doing that, there was an acknowledgement that Native Americans were not American. They were not part of the United States at that time. But there also was a respect of the rights of Native Americans to make their own laws, to make their own governments, and to rule land in their own way. This idea gave way to assimilation, right? And this was especially prevalent under Thomas Jefferson, mainly due to the Louisiana Purchase, which now meant that the United States would occupy much more territory. And during the Jefferson administration, the United States at the time, specifically, white settlers, popular culture, looked towards Native Americans as noble savages. And this is a term that is used to describe kind of the outlook. So you might say the outlook, white Americans had towards Indians. Again, that term savages, which we've talked about already in this class, this is a viewpoint that the English colonists held well before the United States had ever was created. And it was a viewpoint that continued to exist in the United States. But this idea of noble, this applies this idea of assimilation, meaning that maybe Native Americans don't have the proper way of life. That would be, typically that American way of life, namely things like English and Christianity, but can be brought into it, right? And so there were efforts to assimilate. The biggest issue, of course, with assimilation was that assimilation was really a one-way street, that tribes and Native Americans were expected to give up pretty much all culture and become fully adopted into the American system. Now, for some that might work, but for many it didn't, because it meant ditching traditional religious values, ditching traditional ways of living, of community, of language, of dress, right? All those cultural indicators. And also, for those who rejected assimilation, the United States was a lot less tolerant or willing to accept those who refused to give up a certain way of life. And so when you combine the fact that there is increased westward migration, you combine the fact when you have events like the War of 1812, which was a war against Native Americans as much as it was against the British. You add things like the Louisiana Purchase. New technologies like trains and steamships are making it easier to travel and transport goods. There becomes a greater crisis on the West. And what this manifested in was a law in Congress called the Indian Removal Act, again, 1830. The Indian Removal Act essentially says that states are the right for states to remove Indian populations. Right? So the Indian Removal Act essentially says that states have the right to remove Indian populations. Again, laws, where do laws come from? Laws come from Congress. Who makes up Congress? The states make up Congress. So, of course, the states are going to pass a law saying that they have the right to remove Indian populations because the states represent the interests of the states, right? Now, this gets brought before the Supreme Court. We actually talked about this previously. Worcester versus Georgia. And this is a Supreme Court where the Cherokee, right, the Cherokee tribe, sue, right? Well, I don't know if sue is the right word, but the Cherokee bring the Indian removal to court. And essentially, I'll show you what's going on here because it's a little bit better illustrated by this map. So we get an idea of what's exactly going on. So there's pretty much three kind of, actors at play here, so to speak. On the one hand, we're going to use Georgia, right? There's the state of Georgia right there. There we go. There's the state of Georgia, right? Now, the Cherokee inhabit this region of Georgia, right? That's the Cherokee land. And that's the Cherokee land according to who? Well, according to one, the Cherokee, but also according to Washington, D.C. Essentially, the United States has a treaty with the Cherokee saying that they have the right to occupy that land, right? And they have the right to create and conduct their own laws. This new law passed by Congress, Indian Removal Act, says that the state of Georgia, wherever the capital of Georgia is, I don't know what exactly the capital is, but we'll just say it's right there. Now the state of Georgia is saying, no, we want the Cherokee out of our state. And so this then creates a situation where it pits the state of Georgia versus the federal government kind of, with the Cherokee in the balance. And in this court case, John Marshall, again, who is the Federalist Supreme Court judge, rules in favor of the national government and the Cherokee. In other words, John Marshall upholds the principle or idea that the Cherokee can occupy that territory, right, legally speaking. The problem for the Cherokee and John Marshall, both of them, is that while Supreme Court rulings are important, and while the Supreme Court does have the right to rule on constitutionality of legislation, it doesn't have the power to enforce. Right? When it comes to actually enforcing the laws, that's going to be done by the executive and the states. Right? States have their own militias, they have their own police forces. The executive branch, of course, is in charge of the military. Right? Commander-in-Chief of the military, I think, is the official title. And so Andrew Jackson's response to this case was the following: John Marshall has made his decision. Essentially, let him enforce it. Again, can John Marshall enforce his ruling? No, right? The Supreme Court doesn't have like an army. There's no, armed force of the Supreme Court. It relies on the other branches. So despite the fact that John Marshall and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cherokee, Indian removal proceeded, right? And in Georgia and in other places, the Cherokee and others, the 5 civilized tribes, the 5 are the ones mostly in the southern states, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole. The reason why they call them quote-unquote civilized was because these were nations of people who made the effort, or made an effort towards assimilation, right? So this wasn't just the standard rejection of assimilation. This was despite the fact that many of the Cherokee learned English, adopted an alphabet, dressed the way that Americans dress, farmed the way that Americans farm. Despite the fact of assimilating into American society, it wasn't good enough for the state of Georgia and others who forcibly removed them from the land. So those tribes and others were given a certain time period, evacuate the land in 2 years, whatever it was. Some moved, some stayed to protest, hoping that the Supreme Court or others would come to their aid. But when that didn't happen, the U.S. Army rounded up, thousands of Native Americans, of which 4,000 died along the way, and forcibly removed them and marched them to Indian territory or Indian lands, which is modern-day Oklahoma. You can see here some of the various migrations that took place on the map. So, the Cherokee and the Creek were moved this way. The Choctaw, some of the Seminoles. Of all the groups, the Seminoles fought back probably the most effectively, simply due to the fact of the terrain and the geography of the Everglades down there in Florida. So we have the Seminole Wars here. We might call this violent resistance to removal. But in most cases, most other tribes, were not, the U.S. Army had outgunned these groups of people so significantly that no real major fighting took place. And so we collectively refer to these forced migrations as the Trail of Tears, for those who died along the way. And the idea behind it was that by forcibly removing Native Americans to this territory here, that they were not under the jurisdiction of any sort of state at the time. Had the Cherokee just moved from Georgia to Tennessee, well, the next day or the next week or whatever it was, then Tennessee would move to, again, force those people out over and over and over and over again. So this transition, right, of policy, pretty much ends up to outright removal. And we'll talk a little bit more about how policies change, but again, sort of going from this sort of trajectory all the way through Jackson. So that's a major change in U.S. policy there, and certainly is something that falls under the umbrella of Jackson's time in office. Any questions about Jackson's policy regarding Indian removal? Oh, good. So 4,000, those were the people who died on the Trail of Tears. So as this migration took place, as people were essentially forced to march over to this territory here, that's how many people died. I think there were probably somewhere in the ballpark of maybe 30,000 to about 28,000 people who were forcibly moved. I'd have to go and check that number for sure. And yeah, the orders and the policy was to, keep the highest standards of medicine and clothing and food, but the reality was that, people didn't have enough medicine or food, and the conditions were very harsh, and, the numbers sort of speak for themselves. So the 4,000 were those who died on the Trail of Tears. Any other questions? Okay. So the third and last thing about Jackson's presidency that you should know is the Bank War. Right? So 3 major events occurred during Jackson's presidency. Now recall, Jackson represents the interests of the common class. And for the common class, there are a lot of, maybe not a lot, but there are very clear kind of like signs of elite institutions. I mean, so for example, look at some events like the bank panic of 1819. Look at something like the corrupt bargain. This is something that we talked about earlier. And most importantly, the American system. Because when you look at the American system, again, it's really just an alliance between politics, business, and banks. Right? This is like, and sometimes I refer to this as like the unholy alliance, right? What's worse than politics, business, and banks all getting together and making themselves rich? And this was what Andrew Jackson had promised to tear down, right? He had promised to burn it to the ground on behalf of that class. And so during his presidency, what became really a symbol for elitism was this Bank of the United States. Recall that the first national bank was created by Hamilton. That ended under Jefferson's time in office. Again, Jefferson, the Republican, wanted to reverse everything that Hamilton. The second Bank of the United States happened during the era of good feelings. And when Jackson was president, it was set to expire. Right? So the Bank War essentially is the elites, many in Congress, versus Jackson. And Jackson's position is that he wants to, quote unquote, kill the monster bank, while the elites want to re-charter it. Again, when the Second National Bank was created during the era of good feelings, it was set with a time limit on it. It was going to expire in 20 years. And so when Jackson was in office, it was set to expire. And so the big question was, would Andrew Jackson or would Congress pass, right, the elites, those in Congress, those with businesses, those with banking interests, would they pass a new national bank? And anybody who knew anything about the economy understood that not passing the national bank, would be an economic disaster. And so even members of Jackson's own party voted to recharter it. Jackson's response was to veto it. And in an action, really that was on behalf of the common class, right, kind of against all conventional wisdom at the time, the national bank was, quote unquote, destroyed, right? And so that ended the second national bank. The first national bank was gone, second national bank was gone due to Jackson. This political cartoon also kind of illustrates that point. Here's Jackson. He's fighting the many-headed serpent, right? So here's like a guy with a top hat, right? So he's like, a very rich and wealthy individual here. And, the reality is that on the one hand, yeah, this was a major and significant, symbolic point to veto the rechartering of the national bank. But, in the long run, the economy really was hurt, right? That maybe it was better off to go with continuing the national bank. But this really created a lot of opposition to Jackson. He was nicknamed King Andrew, and that was because he used the veto more than all presidents before him, even all presidents before him combined. And he also threatened with the veto. Jackson was the first president to use the veto in a way that persuaded Congress and others to kind of do what he wanted. The veto initially by the founders was created as a check and balance. It was to make sure there was one kind of extra check mark that a law had to go through, right? That a president could veto it. But Jackson used it as a weapon, and he used it very frequently. In fact, the Whig Party was an offshoot of a party that existed to England that was, I believe at the time it was anti-King George, right? So it's kind of, you can kind of get where they got that name from. This was an anti-monarchical party in England. And so Americans just took the same name because this time they accused Andrew Jackson of being the king here, right? In this cartoon, he has a veto in his pocket. He's wearing royal purple, standing over a shredded constitution because he really has no regard for it. Now, by the time of Jackson's exit from office, both the Democrats and the Whigs begin to take on kind of more concrete political positions. I'm not going to talk too much about what their specific positions are, but in general, I will just say that the Whigs were pro-American system. This is a term that we described last chapter, so you should be familiar with it. But remember, an American system, or the American system, is just any type of internal improvement. So this would be pro-tariffs, pro-spending on infrastructure like railroads, pro-national bank, right? And generally speaking, the Democrats were anti-American system. Right? There becomes other sort of indicators of what these parties belong to. So, for example, the Whigs tend to be a little bit more wealthy. They're more Protestant. They generally want more to do with like moral regulation, anti-drinking, anti-gambling, anti-prostitution. The Jacksonian Democrats tend to be a little bit less wealthy sometimes, right? They tend to be more Catholic, more immigrants vote for the Democrats at this time. But again, not too much that we really need to know, right? Again, this is how the parties exist after Jackson. What's also true is after Jackson's presidency is that the position of the executive branch kind of loses its influence. When you look at a lot of these early presidents, really beyond Monroe and until you get to Abraham Lincoln, a lot of weak leadership coming from the executive branch, except for Jackson, of course. And so it was mainly the Senate who provided kind of the important national direction, you might say, in the aftermath of Jackson's presidency. The Great Triumvirate refers to 3 senators, which kind of led the United States in terms of whatever it was, right? And these are Daniel Webster, who for the most part represents the interests of the North. John Calhoun, who represents the interests of the South. And Henry Clay. Right? Henry Clay ran for president 5 times, lost all 5 times. Right? Not a good record, but still very influential. And he was, again, think of Clay as the compromise guy. He's kind of looking for everyone to essentially get along. Of course, Henry Clay's American System right here. That appeared in this chapter again. I just wanted to reiterate the fact that we all understand what this is and that Henry Clay is the biggest supporter of it. Triumvirate, that gets its name from the system of Roman rulers who had great influence in Rome during, I want to say it was right on the transition from republic to an empire, right? Julius Caesar, Octavian, Mark Antony, I think those were some, Crassus, something like that. So it's just sort of a play on words, a play on a historical development, just to say that, really after Jackson, it's really the Senate that is providing leadership, right? You could say the most influential politician in the United States after Jackson is Henry Clay or John Calhoun, right? Those guys were the ones who really had control of their parties. However, though, Jackson's popularity is still significant enough that Martin Van Buren, his vice president, becomes president in, what would that be? 28/32/1836. And I think that would make him the 8th president of the United States. Still a Democrat. But because this monster bank was destroyed, there was also a severe economic panic. And Martin Van Buren bore really the brunt of that. Whereas, as kingly as Jackson was, right, even as much as his critics accused him of abusing his power, he still stepped down after 2 terms in office, right? He followed Washington's lead and did not run for a 3rd term when he probably could have won it rather easily. Again, Van Buren wasn't Jackson. He wasn't a war hero. He didn't have the same sort of authority. And so by the presidential election of 1840, really the Whigs are becoming much more successful. UCCESS, right, successful. They run another war hero in the election of 1840, William Henry Harrison. He's a war hero. And they took a page out of the Democratic book, and that was to appeal to mass voters, right? The log cabin campaign was an effort to portray Harrison as a quote-unquote regular guy. The idea was that Harrison grew up in a log cabin, which again would kind of signify that he came from humble origins, when the exact opposite was the case, right? Harrison was born into a very wealthy family. His family, I believe his father signed the Declaration of Independence, right? So certainly if you were on the Declaration of Independence, you had wealth. But that didn't play in this new democratic era. Remember, this is the era of Jacksonian democracy. Essentially any white man can vote, even if you have nothing in your pockets. Even if you're an immigrant from Ireland and you own absolutely nothing, you barely have any clothes, you can vote. And that meant that politicians had to kind of change their strategies. The election or campaign of 1840 is sometimes called like the first modern campaign. This is to hold things like, parades and pamphlets and platforms and organizations. I mean, political parties really had to go out and get people's votes, especially for individuals who had never voted before, right? Not just get their vote, but remind them and tell them, hey, by the way, you're eligible to vote now, right? Come out and vote for the Whig Party, come out and vote for the Democratic Party. And in 1840, Harrison and the Whigs won. Interesting note about William Henry Harrison. He served as president for the least amount of time, so we might call him the shortest serving president, right? Not like in terms of height, president. And that was because during his inauguration, he gave a very long speech in the freezing cold rain, got pneumonia, and died shortly afterwards. His vice president, John Tyler. So John Tyler is the VP turned president, or P. He is the 10th US president. Was technically a Whig, but ruled as a Democrat. And your book talks a little bit about why the Whigs were frustrated with him. Not really that much, not really a lot of importance there. But I would say certainly with the campaign of 1840 and the election of William Henry Harrison, not just the fact that, politics had forever changed, right? It became a mass movement, right? Campaigns and stuff like that. But it also was an indicator of, that the second party system had essentially arrived, right? Democrats and Whigs were now the parties in the game, so to speak. So that pretty much wraps up chapter 9. All right, any questions on that? Okay.